our times, connecting people who on a day-to-day basis work with communities at a local level, at a national level, and at a sub-regional level around development policy questions. The conversations we're having are coming at a time where we're living through COVID and at infection rates that are estimated in the 5 millions, there are very little signs that are showing a slowdown. And what we have seen for our own region is the extent to which COVID is actually shining the spotlight on the inequalities in our societies. The inequalities in the forms of the responses, the inequalities and issues that dominate the public discourse, but also the inequalities in terms of the resources that are allocated to the response. For this week, I'm joined by 4 colleagues, and we're going to be looking at insights and reflections of Africa's responses to COVID. And the question that we are asking this afternoon is, what does inclusive recovery solutions look like? I'm happy to introduce firstly Shungu Gwarinda, who is the CEO of the Graca Machel Trust. Welcome, Shungu.
Thank you.
And I also have with me Ian Mashingaidze, who is a program director at the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. And lastly is Bhekinkosi Moyo, who is the director of the Center of African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the Wits University. Part of the motivation for today's conversation has been the discussions that we've been having amongst ourselves in a number of calls that we're involved in and emails that we've been exchanging. And we just felt that a lot of the things that we get to talk about need to be out there in the public domain and in the public platform, and to just also get a sense of what others are thinking about the questions that are preoccupying us. Shungu, I know you've got one issue that has been on your mind for a very long time. Do you care sharing?
Sure. So it's a question I think that would be great for us to engage on this conversation, but I'll just start off with, as you said, some reflections and observations. And this is around what can we draw from how Africa and our leaders have managed crisis before and perhaps currently. So really looking at that aspect. I think at the very core of crisis and any crisis events, and now with the COVID pandemic, which is unprecedented, this threatens the established ways of our existence. And as we've noted already, it's been very disruptive, but also is a great test in terms of resilience at an individual level, of communities, of countries, the continent, and globally. But while it is an unprecedented crisis, it also, to an extent, presents an opportunity to perhaps completely reimagine and redesign the development trajectory of the continent. But obviously we know that Africa's landscape has been quite vulnerable in terms of crisis of a massive nature. Be it health-related crisis, if we look at the Ebola outbreak in Central and West Africa around 2014, cholera in Zimbabwe, the HIV pandemic itself, Africa south of the Sahara has been the global epicenter of this pandemic. And so in managing these crises, while these have brought expertise and experience of going through and trying to manage pandemics, what we are faced with is our systems, be it health systems, response systems, that are quite fragile and significantly under-resourced. And so one of the key things the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has really brought to the fore is, investing in strengthening systems, be it health, social response, in how we manage crisis, vis-a-vis kind of a reactive approach that focuses on a specific period of time to stem some of the impact or effects of pandemic. So there's health, climate related. We just recently in the Southern Africa region, experienced Cyclone Idai that affected Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. I think economic and social strife or crisis as well, especially in a continent where economic growth has typically been stunted, and where the bulk of economic activity is in the informal sector. So really reflecting on those aspects, I looked at a case study that was done on, how Africa and our leaders we manage crisis, and how this relates directly to governance. And this case study looked at key aspects from the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And one of the key things that was flagged was that, crisis management is a political and it's a governance issue or a process. So, where public leaders really have to manage crisis in the interest of society. But these interests and society is not homogeneous, as you pointed out, Masego, in terms of the inherent inequalities, be they social, economic, gender related, that exist in our context. And so these crises either, demonstrate whether there are capabilities within public institutions, civil society included, or expose shortcomings in terms of the capacity to respond. And good governance requires a capable state in terms of responsiveness to the needs of citizens. And this case study really identified that countries, the 3 countries that it looked at in West Africa were ill prepared from local, national level, but also global health governance structures did not have the adequate capacity to provide timely response to stem the impact of the pandemic. So the patterns of the response and early warnings suggest that weak governance is really sometimes at the core of or strong governance of whether responses are effective, and is a key ingredient in terms of managing crisis. So what we can draw from some of the observations and experiences to date related to the COVID-19 response, we know that African countries were early responders, either putting in place measures such as partial or full lockdowns or movement restrictions. And I think by the 30th of April, UNECA reports that 42 African countries had put in place partial or full lockdowns, as an example. And also that, there has been acceptance that though this can be looked at from a health lens, it's a multidimensional crisis that's really cutting at the core and fabric of our very existence in terms of social as well as economic. There is an emerging drive to look at managing the pandemic in terms of drawing on the power of the collective. So as an example, Africa CDC is working to try and activate collective procurement or joint procurement, because the procurement numbers and muscle of individual African countries is really struggling in terms of accessing medical supplies on the global market in comparison to perhaps the quantities that other countries and other regions are able to procure on an individual basis. So SADC itself, in its action plan, is trying to reactivate, I think, the facility they previously had that tried to really mobilize that collective in importing bulk supplies. But while those are promising and strong indicative aspects of measures that have been put in place to manage the crisis, there's also been critique. If we look at the context issues specific to Africa, that, for example, 50% or 56% of urban populations in Africa, excluding North Africa, reside in informal settlements or slums. And so measures such as lockdowns and promoting practices such as physical distancing have been problematic, if not impossible, in some of those areas. But also that the pandemic has a direct and disproportionate impact on women, looking at gender inequalities that exist in our communities or society, and representation or inclusion of women in decision-making around the response and perhaps the reconstruction as an element we definitely have been engaging about, trying to think of what reconstruction would look like are some of the key aspects to reflect on. But I'll pause there and perhaps throw that question to yourselves, colleagues, what we can draw from how Africa and its leaders are managing this crisis. And I see, Ian, you're quite attentively nodding and seem to be burning to share. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Shungu, for giving that overview in terms of where we've come from, even your back reference to some of the crises that we've had to deal with on the continent, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, you talk of the Ebolas, you talk of the natural disasters, the recent cyclone Idai that affected 3 countries in our region beginning of last year. So I think we do have a lot of past experiences that we need to see how we can begin to harness. And those are some of the lessons that we need to make sure we collect and we make use of, and as we go forward. But I think one of the things you have mentioned when you're talking about the role of leaders in such crises, I think in this particular crisis, I seem to get the sense that our leaders, they are busy fighting their own fires within their own countries, within their geographical localities. You don't get a sense that there's a collective approach. If you talk of SADC, for example, yes, we see the statements that are coming out from SADC, but it's not very visible in terms of what are the leaders doing collectively across our geographies, across our national boundaries. I think that's something that I really want to see if we can speak to and see what is it that needs to be done in such crises like this, because there might be one country that is struggling with an issue that another country has found a solution to. So if we can encourage this collaboration across our national boundaries, I think that's something that is not very visible if it is happening.
Thank you, Ian. And that's a very important aspect, especially looking at just globally in relation to some of the threats to multilateralism, which is really at the core of, I guess, driving also inclusive responses and recovery. Becky, your thoughts?
Okay, thank you, Shungu. So I think a lot of the points that have been raised are pertinent. I just want to raise a couple of points regarding how our states have responded. I think it's important to also look at the political economy of the continent and of the region. And so if we start from countries that are currently led by former liberation movements, you will notice that the response has been partly militaristic. In other words, you see them adopting a military approach to an invisible enemy. And therefore, issues of human rights violations and other freedoms of expressions are kind of thrown to the back burner in order to advance what we call human life. And we have seen this before in the fight against, terrorism and other forms of, I would say, threats that Africa has seen. There's been an adoption by member states of, human rights versus human lives. And if you're a member state and you adopt a militaristic approach, you want to say you are protecting human lives, even though you end up violating human rights. So that's one of the points that I think is important to put on the table. I think the second is that by adopting such militaristic approaches, what we have seen is, even unnecessary gestures. I still strongly believe that there was no need for President Cyril Ramaphosa, for example, to put on military gear to actually, address the nation on the first time that the lockdown was introduced, because that sent a very wrong message to the armed forces, but also to citizens themselves, that they are going to enforce the lockdown under all manner of, I would say, expressions. And I think that for me is something that, in future we'll have to worry about and think about. But again, I'm not so sure that most of our countries got these lockdowns properly. I think that it was a question of adopting what others in the West have done. And most of the solutions really did not apply to our conditions. If you think about, informal settlements in Nairobi, in the Western Cape and many others, social distancing does not apply. Even if you wanted to, it doesn't apply, because at the end of the day, these people, spend, they live together in big numbers. Asking people to wash their hands regularly and all of that, again, does not apply, because people don't have access to clean water and all of those things. So there was a need, in my view, for our governments to have adopted solutions that would have resonated with what's happening in our context, as opposed to just adopting solutions from elsewhere and using them in our context. And I think that we see some countries that probably tried to get this right in Africa: Togo, Senegal, and to some extent, I would think Kenya as well, where they adopted some kind of a mixed form of a lockdown that still allowed economic activities to continue, but emphasized the public health component, so that the solution comes from communities and is not top down, as it happened in most of our countries. And so I think those are some of the issues that I think are very important to think about as we talk about the responses from the different countries. And the economic muscle of each country is important. South Africa could afford to adopt a hard down lock, but also be able to provide some of the necessary basic commodities. But other countries cannot and couldn't do that. And so again, we have to look at the political as well as the economic context in which these measures were actually adopted.
Masego, I've heard your key responses there in terms of, but yeah, what resonates, Becky, what you flagged in terms of the fundamentals of what informed the different types of responses, as well as the relevance in terms of context. And I guess the question, as you said, of where these solutions come from, and sometimes they really lie within the affected communities themselves in terms of what their needs are and how they can best be addressed, given also, yes, the need to respond to the crisis. Masego?
Thanks. And I actually think that's where one of the major gaps was, right? Was in drawing from previous experiences of African communities in dealing with risk and crisis, and drawing on the fundamental role that communities play as the first point of call for anybody who might find themselves in trouble. And from what you were saying, looking at the African leaders' responses, there was hardly any consultation or consideration of the role that civic society could play, or institutions at a local level could play. And yet we know within the sector, within the public health sector, there's an important role that community health workers play on a daily basis. And they would have played, and they do continue to play an important role in providing information about the hygiene side and the prevention side of the the COVID response message, and doing this almost purely on the basis of their own resources, largely unresourced. But what we've learned is the ability to reach to areas that are hard to get to for our governments, and areas that have always been under-resourced. Going back to what Becky was saying about the political economy of the resources, is the resources often go to where the largest and most influential interests are. And we would have seen that in the physical or social distancing narrative, there was very little conversation about what needs to happen within informal settlements, what needs to happen in crowded areas, in our urban areas, or what even the response could look like in the rural areas. But one of the things that I have been thinking about is just reflecting on the state in which the COVID crisis found civil society in Africa. It came at a point where I think our civil society organizations were at their weakest in terms of institutional capacity, in terms of financial capacity, for them to be able to play their frontline role in a more effective way. In the last couple of years, we have seen a defunding of the civil society space, the challenges that civil society is facing. Apart from the space being closed because of the relationship that civil society has with the state and from a governance point of view, it's just the reality around access to funding. I was just looking at some figures, which I know Becky also spends a lot of time studying, was an OECD report of 2017 that was highlighting that out of 24 billion US dollars of philanthropic funding that was coming to, that was available within the space of philanthropy, only 28% was coming to Africa. But if we unpack that and we say, who was it coming to in Africa, you'll find that only a quarter of that was actually flowing to African-based and African-grown institutions, right? So we find ourselves in a space where there's a crisis. All borders are closed. Everyone is focusing on national responses, and like you said earlier, the multilateral space is undermined. And in that space where people are so preoccupied with what is happening within the confines of their borders, we have institutions that ought to and could respond and support vulnerable communities at a local level, unable to do so because they've been underfunded over the years. So I think there's something there that needs to be paid attention to when we talk about the capability to respond to crisis. It's not just about Ian, could you mute your mic for the feedback? When we talk about the capability to respond to crisis, it is not only about the state capability, but it is about the capability of institutions that should and ought to come together and working on their comparative advantage, working on their sphere of influence, their reach are able to work. And again, going back to state capability is, we haven't even begun to talk about the capability of local government and provincial governments to respond. And yet the crisis hits at the local level. And if everything is centralized and the resources are centralized, you do end up in cases where our local governments are not able to respond. But I don't know how you've been observing this. Shungu, you mentioned the lack of gendered lens, and we saw the negative impact of being so gender blind in the responses, because suddenly lockdown meant locking in women and children who are vulnerable to gender-based violence and locking them in with their abusers. And you know, the levels of trauma and abuse that people get subjected to within this space, you can't begin to imagine what it looks like. Talk about hunger and access to food. Again, the shutdown and the lockdown, you spoke about the impact on the informal trade. I think there's a conversation to be had about when we're saying the informal trade and the informal sector, who are we talking about exactly? Who is in that space? It's women, it's young people, and we're people who are already dealing with the triple evil of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And you put them in a space where they're locked down for endless periods of time. And when we do begin to open the conversation around reopening the economy, no one is talking about what that would look like for the informal space. So I think there's some issues there that I would really like to hear from you about what we're learning about the role of citizens the role of communities, and going forward, what are the kinds of lessons that we ought to take so that we don't find ourselves on the back foot of response strategies that are leaving people worse off than they were before. Becky, can I throw this one at you? You've spent a lot of time looking at role of community foundations, community philanthropy throughout the continent, and just citizen agency in terms of just being part of the solution.
Okay, thank you. So I might as well use this opportunity to address the question, what has been the role of philanthropy, and what have been the responses as well. I think I think it's been very clear to everyone that one, we were supposed to have really anchored our solutions on communities and their various forms of agency. I think we've been here before, you know, with Ebola, with SARS, with the recent cyclones. The first people to always respond to disasters and pandemics of this nature are locals. You know, the international community comes in, but you know, by the time they arrive at the scene, the locals would have already responded and devised some solutions. So I think that's the first point to actually make, that the solutions ought to come from solutions, and there are different forms of agency. But secondly, I think that, you know, at this point in time, and given the nature of philanthropy and civil society, quite strikingly though, I've been involved in different initiatives that are responding to COVID, from the business sector, from government, and from civil society. Quite strikingly though, civil society has remained probably one of the strongest and capable sectors in response to COVID-19. Why am I saying this? I mean, it would appear that, you know, in terms of financial contributions, philanthropy, of course, has responded in big numbers and so on and so. But in terms of capability, I think civil society remains one of the most capable sectors. I mean, we always doubt the capability of civil society in most cases, but in this case, I think we have some examples of how civil society has remained thriving in terms of its operations, but also in terms of its responses, putting together various resources and mobilizing communities in response to some of the, you know, devastating effects of COVID-19. So the relevance of civil society and philanthropy at this point in time has been enhanced in my view, and we have seen different forms of reactions. You know, so what COVID has done is really to bring out the worst out of most of us. And we have seen that in terms of how some states have responded, but also in terms of how some business communities have actually held on from a conservative point of view to actually assisting. But it has also brought the best out of us in terms of solidarity mechanisms and the mobilizations that have come about. And I think that's very important, because philanthropy and civil society is always poised to solve complex societal issues. And I think this is the time when its flexibility, its nimbleness has been called into action. And I think we have seen different forms of reactions, and that has been demonstrated. So like Masego was saying, we are tracking different forms of reactions, and I want to run through some of them now. One is that, you know, philanthropy has responded in the best way in which it knows. And here, I'm not making philanthropy a monolithic entity. I do take into account that there are different forms and different configurations of philanthropy. And so each form will actually respond the best way it sees fit. And I think that for those of you that have been working very closely with foundations, one of the first reactions from foundations was to immediately get in touch with their beneficiaries and communicate that this is a different time. It's an extraordinary time that requires some flexibility in terms of how you can utilize the existing grants that you might have with your partners. And so we received, some of us, letters informing us to think about how we can deploy the current resources the best way we see fit in response to COVID-19. And what that did was really to give flexibility to those partners to be able to address some of the pressing needs, like, you know, moving to virtual forms of working, putting in place systems that would allow you to continue working even under lockdown. And so I think that's one major response that philanthropy did. It's a principal response. And I think that for a long period of time, we were worried that philanthropies were focusing on projects funding and not the overall institutional support. But the second has been to think about, timelines and what it means under COVID-19, because a lot of our grants would have been time bound. But because of COVID-19, what a lot of foundations and funding partners have done is to also allow for the possibility of delays and some of the impacts that COVID-19 might have on those projects. But there's also a very interesting development among some foundations, which is a discussion around, what's going to be the post-COVID-19 world? What is it going to look like? Will the current funding strategies of our various donors still be relevant in the post-COVID-19? And some donors feel that they might have to change their strategies and allocate resources differently. And if that does happen, what does it mean for the existing partners that they currently fund? And so one of the responses has been to think about either a one-year additional grant to what is existing or multi-year grants to actually allow for the current partners the ability to use that period in order to pivot to new ways of working while donors actually shift their strategies. And so in other words, is to avoid an abrupt exit from their partners. But the point I'm making is that the big question that philanthropy has been confronted with is whether they should continue supporting the current partners under COVID-19, even though they may not be working on COVID, or they should actually reallocate their resources to those institutions that are working on COVID. And I think we have seen a lot of institutions cutting back the budgets that they had earmarked for certain institutions and certain programs and allocating them now to COVID-19. So these are some of the trends that I think have been very fascinating from the foundation side of things. But I think you also know that because of the lack of economic performance in most of our countries, a lot of our donors' investments as well as endowments are also affected. And what this might mean for the funding world is either a conservative approach where you wait and see whether or not the economy will pick up and then start allocating resources. And so a conservative approach is what some of the donors have adopted and some of the philanthropic institutions have adopted, just to wait and see how the world is going to turn out. But there are some who have been very, I would say, progressive, who have seen COVID-19 as an opportunity to actually spend their resources in response to some of the key issues that affect the world right now. But I think collaboration, somebody mentioned it, is actually one thing that has come out here in terms of both what we see, for example, in South Africa through the Solidarity Fund and many other initiatives that have been put in place that, no one institution thinks they can do this on their own. And so, we are seeing lots and lots of initiatives that pull on the different synergies and different resources that each person brings to the group. And so collaborations are going to be very important going forward. And so I think that in relation to collaborations is also the question of technology. I think this is the time when we see both governments as well as civil society and various arms of society basically adopting, digitization and the different forms that the fourth industrial revolution might bring on board as new ways of actually adapting to the new normal. And so there's no doubt in my mind that all institutions currently are thinking about how to enhance technology as a way to assist them moving forward. And this is one key area that I see a lot of philanthropic institutions and donors are going to be inundated by people wanting to be supported in order to build systems and processes that will allow them, whether it's COVID-19 or any other pandemic, to be able to move smoothly. I think at this point in time, a lot of our groups were caught unaware, unprepared, but this is the opportunity for civil society and philanthropy to actually prepare for any other eventual pandemic or disaster that might force people to operate remotely and otherwise. But I think, one of the things I want to raise is about, the state of our high net worth individuals in the continent. They are growing in big numbers in terms of population, but also in terms of amounts. And before COVID-19, we're beginning to see a lot of them beginning to support and give continentally. I mean, they are used to giving in the US and in Europe, especially those that would have started out there. but they were beginning to give also continentally. But what COVID-19 has just done is to force them back into their local realities. And so they are giving locally. They are expected to respond locally first, and then, if they do have additional budgets, they can look externally. Of course, there are exceptions, but I think one of the most important observations that I think we should challenge our high net worth individuals is whether it needed to take Jack Ma all the way from China to actually support all the 55 countries in terms of supplying, medical supplies, testing kits, and otherwise. Yet we actually have similar people of the same standing, same kind of wealth in Africa who could have actually done exactly that. And so the challenge that has been thrown to our high net worth individuals is to really think continentally and not think locally, because I think once you think locally, you are almost falling into the same trap that we have seen our governments operating from, which is that they want to take care of their own citizens. But what does that mean? Basically, I mean, we are all going into easing lockdowns right now. The moment we start traveling and borders are open, international travel is allowed, those that did not really take care of their citizens are likely to reinfect others in the region and continentally. So this idea that you only focus locally is very, in my voice, narrow, but it's also limited, because it's really going to come back and haunt a lot of our country. So high net worth individuals have also found themselves thinking locally as opposed to think globally. So I will come back to reflect on some of the ways going forward, what I think philanthropy and civil society should focus on going forward. But I want to stop here and maybe pause for some discussion.
Thanks. Shungu, you want to go?
Yeah. Just a thought as Becky was talking about high net worth individuals and the aspect of philanthropy. And I think a dimension of philanthropy that perhaps us as civil society need to begin recognizing, engaging with more is really at the individual level. Of those who are not necessarily high net worth individuals. I think, as we were talking earlier about community responses, and that, locals are typically the first to go out there, respond, look at what the needs of community members are, and provide that support. We are seeing fantastic examples of this on a daily basis of people who have tapped into their own meager resources to provide to, if it's children, food on a daily basis, and provide the most basic of needs and care. And so if we look at models and concepts around philanthropy and more long-term on different ways in which, for us as civil society, as you said, the funding pool, the resourcing pool has shrunk. The economic impact means, yes, there is less out there in terms of being invested in the social support and the work that we do, and really sustaining institutions, not that we should aim to sustain ourselves for the sake of, but in terms of the important work that we do. I think that is another aspect of engaging and valuing from an individual level. When I was reading through the list of contributions from the Solidarity Fund in South Africa, there was quite a significant pool of individuals, some who contributed 5 rand, 10 rand. And so when we look at the power of the collective and collaboration and contributions, yes, at institutional, organizational level, I think it's really for us to begin paying attention to communities and what they have, putting value to that, no matter how small it may be in terms of comparatively looking at bigger development assistance or philanthropy mechanisms and funds that exist out there, because there is impact and there is value and an opportunity to really build closer bridges with the communities that we work with and support. And in ways that, mobilizing more of such contributions is a way of also building those pathways for inclusion, for engagement in the processes that we look at, and how we design our interventions and programs, the ways we identify or engage on what are the specific needs of those communities and how we also invest or utilize those resources. So really that aspect of if there's high net worth, perhaps we call them low net worth individuals that have $1, that have $10, and are putting that forward, even basic material support in terms of the response. But also that, the family as a sphere and communities in our countries that have either very weak and in some cases non-existent social protection systems has been the sphere with civil society, yes, but that has really held the welfare needs of members who are marginalized and in need. And so one thought has really been, while the influence and access for big business, for example, the private sector, in terms of informing where available relief support goes, or how the easing of lockdowns should go, and how either tax regimes or relief measures are being put in place at an institutional level. Families in themselves are institutions that are really carrying the burden of social protection and welfare support as well. And so I think as civil society, really, because we are at the grassroots, really have these engagements and connections with the communities that we support, beginning to look at how some of these responses and recovery measures can also look at relief for families that are supportive in terms of welfare. Was it, I think the SADC forum of central banks had an engagement recently, and they were looking just at flows in terms of volume of remittances, cross-border remittances, and that over the last 2 months already there has been a decline of about 40% in the volumes of that. So it really shows, yes, the economic knock that individuals and families are taking at a very local level, but the importance of the family sphere and those individual support mechanisms in terms of social protection in contributing to economies. Some governments, those remittances are a significant contribution in terms of forex flows, but really in also covering that gap where either civil society, the state, and market, because they have a responsibility too, are unable to, especially now, cover the welfare and social support needs of communities. So I think really looking at how we begin to mobilize, engage, value individual giving that is low net worth or whatever we want to call it, but also recognizing that the responses need to begin to look much more strongly at the family sphere as the first line of support for communities that are affected, and that will also be the first line of support as we eventually begin to also push through and think more around recovery. But another aspect is in relation to, what the pace and the volumes of contributions to either national support funds that have been put in place, or where your high net worth individual, corporates, and foundations are investing in the response, is in relation to civil society, how we need to also think about having conversations to perhaps remodel the way giving and support flows through and is channeled to organizations. I think it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of capacity to fundraise, to mobilize, and sometimes that deflects in terms of the time invested in the core of the work on the ground with community. And so long term, if there has been, I think we have very good examples of the ability to mobilize collective funds, at national and local levels. And while issues around social investment funds are still very much in their incubation or nascent stage, I see this perhaps as an opportunity for us to really drive that agenda and have those conversations to look at, mechanisms, the manners of giving, the channels of giving to civil society organizations, what mechanisms that are coordinated, that are collaborative, that are significant, that can also be investments to support in the long term, so that planning and strategizing and supporting communities moves from 1 year, 2 year cycles, and can be also a bit more long term and much more substantive in terms of the outcomes we want to realize. I think there's a, an opportunity that I'm quite excited about, and hopefully that we can, as a collective, collaborate around engaging to say, yes, there might be less resources, but how can we be more creative and work smarter than harder in terms of how we mobilize and channel resources to support our work?
Yeah, thank you, Shungu. I'm actually glad you brought up the point around community philanthropy, because as Becky was talking about civil society having demonstrated their capability in the state, I was thinking they could do that because they were riding on the support that they were getting to be able to deliver, to respond in this time, often came from communities. There's examples of I Am for Bulawayo, which is a COVID response fund that individuals came together to say, how do we make sure that hospitals in Matebeleland, which is a marginalized region in Zimbabwe, can get the same amount of, or even more investment back into building the capability of the health sector to respond. And as Becky was talking about philanthropy and foundations, I couldn't help to think that you are describing progressive foundations. And I wonder whether that is a common pattern that we see in the philanthropy space, because our own experience, talking as the Southern Africa Trust, is yes, we've been fortunate to have foundation partners that fall within that category, who were the first to respond when we said, look, it is not a question of diverting funds that you've allocated to us before, but there's also a question to be had around the need to increase the flow so that we are able to do more and support more organizations. And 3 or 4 organizations responded to that call. The rest, we were hitting a brick in the sense that they were also diverting the little resources that they have to respond to the challenges within their national or local settings. And that inspired the Southern Africa Trust, the African Philanthropy Network, and Trust Africa to set up a continental-wide solidarity fund, if you like, that just basically drives the message home that says, look, we are not safe until all of us are safe. So it doesn't make sense to concentrate resources in our own immediate localities if we're not thinking about how migrants are being catered for, if we're not thinking about how people in townships are being catered for, if we're not even having conversations about the resilience of the institutions that we know always step up as frontline organizations. So I think while there's a lot of good lessons to be learned from the progressive arms of philanthropy, we need to see more and more of that kind of support. And still, there's a message to be said there around having a real look at the flow of funding, what the implications of the changes in the funding landscape have been for local community capabilities to respond to challenges of their time. I'm looking at the time and we're running out of time. There was something that Becky said, which I'd like Ian to pick up. And Becky, you started talking about technology and access to technology and the new normal and new ways of working. And I know is a subject that Ian puts on the table quite often. Ian, would you like to share some of your reflections with us?
Yeah, thanks, Masego. Yes, indeed, Becky started talking about beginning to look forward, because I think a lot of this conversation, we've been looking at what is happening now regarding the response to the pandemic, but also looking back in history, the HIV and AIDS epidemic, you talk of the Ebolas, you talk of some of the natural disasters that we have had to deal with in the region as well as across the continent. And when we talk about disaster risk reduction, we always talk about the importance of linking immediate or short-term response programs with long-term development. And I think this is a conversation that we need to also have in beginning to look forward. And the question I want to put on the table is, what does the future look like for civil society as well as the communities that the civil society is serving as a way of beginning to build resilience, because these disasters are always coming back. Today is the pandemic. Just earlier, just ended the rainy season. We were dealing with floods. South Africa had major challenges with floods. You talk of the recent beginning of last year, Cyclone Idai, impact in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Malawi. You go back the Ebolas and everything. So each and every time we do have these disasters coming back. But the problem is that they are always like a moving target. Shungu has also started talking about some of the lessons that we are getting, the innovations in the response. Another question is, how can we begin to harvest those lessons and generate knowledge that can begin to help us as we go forward, so that when similar disasters or any other disaster comes, we are able to deal with it and using the lessons from the past. But also another critical element that I don't think we've talked about at all is what they call indigenous knowledge systems, okay? We are talking about the current, we are talking about the immediate past, but if you go way back in history, there's a lot of lessons that I think could also help as we begin to talk about building resilience, as we begin to talk about how communities can prepare for the future, how civil society can support building resilience in our communities to be able to cope with future disasters. You have been talking about Zimbabwe, Masego, your examples. Let me pick one as well from Zimbabwe, a concept that they call Zunde Ramambo in the local language, which is the chief's granary, where community members, after their harvest, they will contribute a portion towards that granary, which is like a storehouse where the chief keeps it in terms sort of to support any future needs, particularly with your vulnerable households within your communities. And these are lessons we are saying, what is it that we can learn by going back in history and harnessing that indigenous knowledge system, that indigenous knowledge, and how can we use it to begin to inform some of the responses? Yes, we do have the new innovations. Yes, Becky talked about technology, how we need to use it as we go forward. And I think those are conversations we need to have. But finally, the abnormal is the new normal. And one major issue I also want to pose is in South Africa, we've been on lockdown the past 55 days. Some of us, we started a bit earlier than that. 2 weeks before that, we started self-isolating, working from home, not in the office. Something that we thought was not very easy, or it was very difficult to manage and everything, but it looks like it's working very, very well. And everybody I'm talking to, they seem to agree with me that we seem to be working much longer hours, much harder even, a lot of productive time because of no disruptions like when you're in the office, the time we spent commuting to work, the frustrations, traffic and everything, we've cut out all of that. And these are things that I'm also saying as we begin to look forward, what lessons can we draw from working from home that all of us, or the majority of us at least, were not really directly on the core face of the response? What lessons can we learn from these experiences that we can use as we go forward? I would love to get some perspectives from the team in terms of beginning to look forward, not just for civil society, but also for the communities that we're talking about that are adversely affected by these crises whenever they come.
So happy to start with some, well, firstly, a reaction to the working from home. And I'm not sure why Masego, you are chuckling, but it's really very relative, because what we've learned as well, Ian, is where, there's a lot of unpaid work that especially women do within the household. with children not also being in school, there's the childcare responsibility. So the home environment has multiple dimensions in terms of as an approach, and where I think that if it's not quadrupled burden of household, childcare, and trying to work, well, being teachers as well, where some parents also have to spend time, mornings for those of us who have the privilege in terms of connectivity and access to be continuing with schooling during this time. So I think that particular aspect, again, as we look to the future, is really being conscious of the deep inequalities that exist, and that the digital divide exists, and that as we look towards the future and leveraging the lessons, but also how we've adapted, the successes in terms of adapting and leveraging technology. I think just the fact that we are having this webinar and haven't had to spend much on flights and so forth is a positive, because resources are limited. But what it also means is that access and the divide can widen, especially looking at the rapid pace at which we've all been literally leapfrogged into this major phase of the fourth industrial revolution. But at our office at the Graca Machel Trust, we have a caption that reads, "The future is African, the future is female." And so for us, what we think is critical is really, and which is really drives our mission, is putting women at the center of the response, not just as actors, as the major deliverers of healthcare support, with 65-70% of nurses, for example, being female, but also that when we look at, we're reading a report from McKinsey, which focused on African economies or global economy as well, growth and pre-COVID. And one of the findings was of their analysis in relation to gender equality was that there was $12 trillion, was being the operative term here now, that could be added to the global GDP by 2025 by advancing women's equality and economic participation that is better supported and elevated. So I think when we look to the future, therein lies a huge untapped aspect of whatever response or reconstruction strategies that would be put in place to address the economic dimensions of crisis and recession, but also, as we know, that directly impacts or is related to social. And so looking at responses that have a gendered approach, when we talk of quote unquote the informal sector, 70% of economically active women in Africa are in what we call the informal sector. And so their access in terms of financing, in terms of markets, in terms of even the relief support that is being put in place in some countries that do have the economic capability or financial capability to do that, has barriers in itself. So you have some of the structural, systemic barriers and inequalities that have existed, being also the danger of pulling those into what would be the post-COVID recovery. So I think really that aspect of putting women at the center in terms of the economic drive, but also in terms of leadership, right? Indications are that countries that have female leadership have had much more effective responses, not only in flattening the curve, but in terms of empathy and trust in how citizens have also responded to measures that these countries have put in place. And so this really points to new approaches to leadership, but inclusion of women as leaders in terms of driving the response and reconstruction is another critical aspect that we would strongly, advocate for and drive. as we look to the future. And when we look at some of the frameworks, and yes, as a continent, we have a plethora of frameworks, policies, protocols, beautifully written, launched, and so forth. But it's the action, accelerating the action, putting those who are most affected and where opportunities for change really lie at the center of informing those actions or changes that need to happen to really, I think, maximize, hopefully, on the opportunity that this crisis presents in terms of reflecting on systems that are more inclusive and more responsive to citizens' needs.
Yeah, thank you, Shungu. You know, at the beginning, I sort of chuckled because I was thinking, working from home, it really depends on who is having that discussion and the experiences, right? Is it working from home? Is it working at home? And is everybody able to do that? I think the future of work for us in civil society is to really think hard about how we meet people and communities and individuals within the communities from where they're at. What does that, you know, Becky was talking about the role of technology in you know, digitization and also in improving this flexible working arrangement and people's ability to work from home. The reality of it is when we look at connectivity and when we look at access, it is not the same for everyone. So we have to, like, now at the moment start thinking about what this would look like for people in rural areas, for instance, in areas where the networks might be weaker. I'm very alive to the reality that, yes, we've got this platform that we have ambitiously you know, called Society Talks, but I know that it's not everybody who's able to plug in and have these conversations. And we would love to have at some point the ability to actually be able to connect in a meaningful way to communities at a local level. So they're also part of the discussion. So I think that inequality around access to technology is something that we need to pay attention to and has to be part of our advocacy agenda going forward. And partnerships with people who are innovating in this space. What kind of solutions are they putting in place? Just at the beginning of COVID responses, I started to do, you know, mapping how organizations that support social movements are preparing to work remotely with this social or physical distancing phenomena. And I was encouraged by a campaign that was launched by 1,000 Currents. And their campaign was simple. It was a campaign to mobilize resources so that they can improve the connectivity for a majority of their constituencies, because they still wanted to be able to be in touch. They wanted to be able to have conversations about what we're learning from community responses and so forth. I think that's one area that we need to invest in. There's some interesting questions that have come up, and I'd love to throw them back to the panel. The first one is that I'm going to read out is a comment that comes from Nancy, and she says, unpaid labor is the biggest and highest value of philanthropy. Unpaid labor is the biggest, highest value philanthropy of all. Unfortunately, involuntary philanthropy, it is involuntary philanthropy, but it's good to remind philanthropists of the relative value of their contributions. And again, it just goes back to when we're talking philanthropies, who are we talking about? Are we underestimating the value that communities give, just in terms of the forms of their philanthropy? And then a comment from Janet is endogenous development is what we need to push for as a lesson from the COVID-19 responses. It'll be interesting to spend a bit of time on that. Ian had mentioned something about indigenous knowledge systems. We have a very interesting comment and question here from Marlon, where he says, what are we learning from Madagascar, from the Madagascar herbal remedy debate and the role of traditional knowledge and assets in confronting global disasters? What lessons do we draw from that? And then Janet making a contribution to sources of funding and the role of communities, makes a comment here that crowdfunding has worked before in Zimbabwe to fight the cholera epidemic in 2018. And ordinary citizens were contributing through e-cash, mobile money, through very localized initiatives. Yes, these are the questions that and comments that have come through. Just wondering if you'd like to respond to any of those. Becky, perhaps I should start with you. You haven't spoken for a while, and we challenged that rosy picture you gave us of philanthropy.
Okay, thank you. I do agree that maybe in my characterization of philanthropy, I might have spent a lot of time on progressive philanthropy, and maybe left out the discussion on those that I said are very conservative, and they've actually looked inwards in terms of responding to their own challenges. But also, I mean, when I talk about philanthropy, I also am cognizant of the fact that individuals are actually at the center of philanthropy. And in fact, what we have seen across all the countries, and we are tracking that right now across the 5 regions of the continent, is that individuals were the first to provide goods, time, money, skills, and through crowdfunding that Janet has referred to, a lot of the responses are actually collected online. And I think this takes me to also, to address one of the issues around the future, which is that we have to contend with the fact that for a foreseeable time, we are going to be dealing with online communities. And that also changes the way in which we should be thinking about our approaches, our organizing formulas and mechanisms, the kind of security concerns that we need to start thinking about as groups that are operating in this space, but also in terms of how we are going to mobilize resources, mobilize people, how are we going to reach them, what our institutional design is going to look like going to the post-COVID-19 world. And so I think that's important to think about that we are no longer going to spend a lot of time in physical contacts, even though we might want to go back to the traditional forms of working. We are dealing with online communities. And that's very important. I think the second point that is probably related to Marlon's question, I mean, I'm not going to try and touch it. I'm not a specialist in that area, but I think what COVID-19 has done is to show us the link that exists between the environment and human beings. And I think that we have not addressed that much in this debate, but it's very clear to us that during the times when we've gone on lockdowns, Mother Earth has been resetting in various ways. And I think that going forward, it will be very important to pay attention to the link between humanity and the environment. And let's not forget that science is very much political and contested. And right now, we actually see that the science community in South Africa, to start with, is very much divided, especially around what informs government policy towards easing or not easing the lockdowns. And a lot of what is now coming out is the fact that science is funded. So there's a lot of donor money that goes into science. There's a lot of reputation and credibility that goes into most of these scientists. And so we are beginning to see the cracks within the science community. But what we have not dealt with is the indigenous forms of support and some of the approaches that Ian was talking about. Those of you that attended the meeting on the disaster management, there was a very interesting presentation that said, traditionally people have different mechanisms to alert them of the disasters on the way. And those traditional mechanisms are always spot on in terms of actually identifying the disaster and beginning to help communities to put in place mechanisms to respond. So I'm probably saying that there might be some truth to what the Madagascar government is proposing. The only problem is that we don't have a local body that could either accredit or verify what they are proposing. But I have no doubt that some of our traditional forms of help do actually address issues of immune system, for example. You can boost your immune system from some of these traditional medicines. But I think it's the politics of science that has come into place here in terms of whether we are going to throw away the Madagascar solution just like that, or we are going to subject it to some verification, testing, and accreditation. So I mean, I'll leave that to Ian because I think that's one of his areas of specialization. My last point, Masego, is I think, one of the things that we are going to contend with is that, COVID-19 has shown us that government can be open. Government can be open and can be challenged, and government can actually, respond effectively if it wanted to. And so the biggest question that we have and we have to contend with going to the future is, why did it take COVID-19 for government to actually be able to take people from homelessness, be able to deliver the basic commodities to different communities, and actually even operate efficiently without some of the ministries that they currently have. So currently, if you realize, there are just a few ministries that are actually in operation. The other ministries are nowhere to be seen. And so there is something that has come out of this that shows us the effectiveness that could actually come out of government, come out of civil society, also come out of the corporate sector. But it really did not need COVID-19 for us to actually do that. Why does it need a pandemic for society to be able to go back and reset and take care of its own people? So that, for me, is one of the most important things. And this is a challenge to philanthropy, to actually focus on things that are going to make a bigger impact going forward.
Thanks, Becky, for that response. Yes, definitely. Science is contested, like you rightly said, and the example you gave in South Africa regarding the response to the pandemic is a typical example. But regarding the Madagascar remedy, this is where one would have expected our African scientists to have quickly rushed to confirm the efficacy of that remedy, but not just to do that, like you said, Becky, but also to patent it. Because a lot of times the scientists from the north, from the west, they come, they pick on this, they go do their experiments, confirm, verify, whatever, then they patent. And the next thing is we are buying from them something that is homegrown or a solution to an issue that we know existed if you go back in our history. I think these are some of the issues that we need to continue talking about as we go forward, as well as to begin to see how do we protect our indigenous knowledge system so that we don't end up paying through the nose for solutions that we've always been using. As well as, yes, the early warning systems that we have in our communities, how can we begin to use them much more than relying on science to tell us or to give us the forecast, the predictions, whereas our indigenous knowledge systems, if you go to the villages, the old Mandalas, they know these things. And I think those are some of the issues we need to continue talking about. The new ways of working, yes, again, let's continue talking about this. Let's see going forward, but also the important question of the marginalized communities who don't have access to some of these technologies that we are using to work from home or to work at home, whatever it is. I think let's continue the conversation.
Thank you. Really a powerful thing there to note what is science and whose science matters. And in this, is this an opportunity for us to place value in African indigenous knowledge systems, invest in the research and development, but like you said, have Africans actually rally around some of the resource base that we have. I think the space of the pharmaceutical industry has shown us just how contested the space is, and just the risks around intellectual property rights that arise when we don't pay attention to what is happening in that space. I quite like, there's a number of questions that you have all raised, which I think would be excellent topics for future discussions. Becky began to talk about the connection between human well-being and ecosystem well-being. And if there's anything that has taught us about the holistic nature and how connected as humanity we are to the environment, how the economy connects to the environment and to humanity and human well-being and environment vis-a-vis that cycle of life, there's no better moment to than this to reflect on that. And we will bring colleagues who are specialized in that area, communities who spend a lot of time sharing messages around that, to come and share their insights with us. I have an announcement to make, but before I get to the announcement, I have one last question for each one of you, and we wrap up what has been an exciting conversation. And this is a question that we ask our panelists all the time: is post-COVID, what we want Africa to look like? What is your vision? What is the future that you want us to come back to post-COVID? Shungu, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I'll repeat at the trust, as we say, the future is female, and the future is really about the continent. So inclusion is what we would like to see in terms of the continent and its aspirations, and what a reconstructed a continent would look like. Inclusion in terms of decision making from the local level, inclusion in terms of framing responses, determining where resources go, how they are utilized, and inclusive approaches that really also look at who is the most affected in terms of when crises happen, also when systems fail in terms of social protection, as well as economies. And so that would be the Africa we want to see, but also an Africa where when we look at, we celebrate that 60% of our population is youth, and there's a demographic dividend to leverage there, but there needs to be support for us to realize those benefits. And so also approaches that really provide holistic development of young people from when they're children. 30% of our children are stunted in terms of malnutrition. So really approaches that invest from the beginning is the aspiration of the Africa we would want to see, and can really leverage to drive growth on the continent that is inclusive. And what our founder, Mrs. Machel, calls, the next frontier, or the second liberation. The first liberation was more on a political front or lens, and the second liberation needs to really focus in terms of inclusive growth and economies that provide, and not just provide, but support active engagement of the marginalized, especially women and youth.
Thank you, Shungu. Ian?
Can I jump in, Masego? Yes, thank you. I was going to jump in. Shungu talked about inclusion. At the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, we say that the future is African, definitely. I agree with Shungu. But for us, the future is in its, the future of the African continent is in its young people. We always talk about the youth dividend. And I want to say that there's nothing we can talk about the future of the African continent if we don't talk about perhaps the greatest resource that we have, which is our young people. So for me, the future I want to see is a future where our young people begin to actively take control of creating the Africa they want, and they need to do it now. Before we talk about the future, we need to create that future. And for us to create that future, let's give the responsibility to our young people. Let our young people take that responsibility. Sometimes they wait to be given that responsibility. They should not wait. They should take the lead in claiming that responsibility to create that future that they want. So for us, nothing for the African continent without its young people, and nothing for the young people without the young people.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. Becky.
Okay, thanks. Let me start by endorsing both Ian and Shungu's Future Africa. For me, though, I think that both have addressed issues of inclusion, which are very important, and I want to endorse that. But I also want us to address the issue of an equal Africa. I think what COVID has really demonstrated to us is the extent to which different forms of inequalities actually exist among us. And the reason why we see so much attention from the middle class and some of the elite is because their interests are at stake with this COVID. If you look at the previous pandemics, the attention wasn't as this big, the scope wasn't this big, because the interests of the rich, the elite, and the middle class were not really that affected. So this is a disease that was brought by the elite and the middle class, and they have to respond because of that. So the levels of inequality have just been expressed, even exacerbated. And so I would want us to see a situation where there's an equalization from all different forms in the form of supporting local initiatives, whether it's in the area of education, the environment, creating decent work, job creation. And I know that social services is going to be one of the big issues going forward. But we are entering what we call a brave new world that we are constructing. And I think this is where civil society and philanthropy need to position themselves. It's an Africa that is complex, that will require dexterity, that will require innovation, critical thinking, and constant pivoting to new developments and trends that I think are going to be emerging as challenges. So that's my future, and that's what I see us getting ourselves into going forward.
Thank you, Becky. And thanks, colleagues. This has been an exciting conversation, and we could carry on and on and on and on and on and on. We covered quite a wide range of topics, talking about state capability at the beginning and a reflection around state responses, and then moved the conversation to the role of society, the role of civil society, and had a very important conversation about the kinds of responses that we're seeing playing out in the philanthropic space, and unpacking that to say, what is philanthropy? Who are philanthropists? And what else are we seeing outside of the bigger foundations, just in terms of how Africans have stepped up to respond to the COVID crisis. We talked about the future of work, what that looks like for civil society organizations, but also what we need to think about if that is going to be an inclusive future. And you have shared, all of you have shared what the new normal that we want to come back to is. And I think we need to all work hard in making sure that that post-COVID future is one that does not take us back to where we've been. It's not one that takes us back to the structural drivers of the crisis that we have even experienced before COVID, the 2008 financial crisis that then became an economic crisis. We know the kinds of risks that come with the increase in natural disasters and the role that climate change is playing in that increase that we are seeing. That is the 4 organizations that are represented in this platform today. We have an important announcement to make, and Becky earlier talked about the future in the civic space being that of collaboration. We're happy to announce that the last Wednesday of every month, we will be hosting, through Society Talks, a joint webinar series where we'll be discussing topics of interest and importance in our continent. We will come back here to look at questions of food security and food insecurity as is experienced now in the past, but also what we need to do looking into the future to address questions of food sovereignty. We will come back and unpack a little bit deeper the questions of community foundations and what that does in terms of and community philanthropy and its role in shifting the power and self-determination around the development agenda. Somebody in their comments talked about we need to enforce endogenous development, and we don't do that unless we are playing an active role in resourcing and driving that, and also acknowledging the unpaid labor and work that Nancy and colleagues have talked about. We will come back and in more in-depth look at questions around the role of youth the challenges that women are facing at the moment, but also the kind of future that we are looking at in order to have an inclusive future. We would like to bring back civil society representatives in their different forms, social movements, NGOs, and other groupings to have a roundtable where we get to hear firsthand what their own lived realities are. Just remember, the last Wednesday of every month, you can look forward to exciting conversations. In between that collaborative platform, drawing on the 4 institutions, we will continue with the weekly webinar Society Talks series driven by the Southern Africa Trust. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to my colleagues for bringing yourselves and your insights and your liveliness into this discussion. I'm going to ask that you stay on for a little bit while we switch off our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us today, and see you again next week. Ciao.
Thank you.